Tragedy has befallen me as of last night. I am missing 2 fingers.
No, you're not missing 2 fingers.
I'm missing 2 fingernails.
There's 2 fingernails that are missing. And are those called acrylics?
Yes. You know?
I know some things.
What else do you know?
You have nails that are not actual human fingernails attached to your actual human fingernails.
Correct.
And 2 of those artificial nails, or acrylics as they're called, it appears have broken.
Oh my gosh, I'm so impressed right now.
That I know some things.
Oh my gosh.
I'm celibate. I'm not stupid.
Ever. Yeah, so I decided to swim last night and I was doing backstrokes and
you hit a wall?
I hit the wall and it hurt, and I didn't notice until I got in my room and I was like, oh, I'm missing 2 nails. And it would have been devastating had it actually pulled off my real nail. I would have had to go somewhere else.
Yeah, you would have noticed that right away, I would imagine.
Yeah, that one happened to my sister.
Yeah,
she was playing basketball, and the basketball took off her actual nail.
Why would you have fake nails attached to your nails when playing basketball?
Because it was 8th grade, and it was like the summer, like 8th grade graduation, so all the girls were getting their nails done. Then she played basketball, and she didn't take care of them, / she didn't take them off when she should have. So her being her, that's when it happened.
Yeah.
And then the nurse continued to rip off the rest of her nail.
Yeah, well, sometimes that's the only way to go. So
well, the doctor said they shouldn't have done that. Well, because it had already come off, so it was already broken.
Oh.
So what they could have done is just let it regrow. Instead, the nurse went ahead and just pulled, Camp
Ouch.
Simmons.
Ooh.
It was a great time.
That hurts quite a bit.
Yeah, so that's my only painful experience at the moment.
Yeah, no, I don't like thinking too much about that.
Me neither. And I texted my sister because she's the one who does nails. So it's a cool little side business. And then I said to her, I'm not allowed to have these kind of nails, knowing that I'm kind of rough, because I already broke my other nail 2 weeks ago, and she had to fix it. And I was like, you know what? I'm not made out for this life. So let's just do regular manicures with me for the rest of the year.
I'm just glad that this isn't a part of my life. Like, I'm real happy with that. Real happy with that.
That's all I'm bringing to the table at the moment.
Your nails? That's all you got.
I mean, what else is going on?
This is interesting. I mean, you found a quarter. You're all excited.
I found a quarter. I don't know why there's a random quarter on the table in front of us.
Because why not?
It's just a random. Oh, I know why.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question for you. This is what I want you to talk about.
Okay.
The method modeled by the master. Right? We say this a lot. We talk about it a lot.
Curtis Martin's tagline.
Yeah. So I want to get into a little bit about what it is, especially as the Fellowship of Catholic University Students Focus uses it. And then
I'm going to pull up my presentation.
I just kind of want to go off of that. I want to riff a little bit about the method modeled by the master.
Riff, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a good thing. It's a good thing, because I don't have any criticisms of it. So I just want you to describe it first in terms of like what it means when we're talking about it, because it's come up many times in the podcast.
Yeah.
The method modeled by the master. We talk about discipleship a lot.
Yeah.
I just want you to talk about that first.
Okay. As you continue.
And tell me about that. What that means.
I gotta pull up my presentation.
All right.
Because if you were at the presentation that I made for small groups and I explained it, it's also in a little book.
That's like I have to go to stuff that you do. Ugh.
I go to mass and you're there. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. But
yeah. Right. No, a similar obligation
no,
exists
I think what you
go
were
to
doing
Holy
that
Mass
day.
And worship God.
I think you were fishing that day.
I feel like that's a pretty good reason for me to do this. That's a pretty.
I was like, he's not coming to my presentation.
Excuse.
He's going fishing. Okay, whatever. It's fine.
Yeah, it's terrible to take a day off,
I know. So I need to find out how to find this on the internet. Google Slides. How do I do that? Oh.
You don't need it. You know
right.
the method modeled by the master.
Yeah, but there's some like really good.
And you know it inside and out.
All right, fine. Here we go.
Give the elevator pitch for what this is.
The method modeled by the master. A precursor to this book is a book by Dr. Coleman called The Master Plan for Evangelization, which is written by a Protestant pastor who talks about how Jesus actually evangelized. And the whole book pretty much gives you a whole structure for the way that the Lord evangelized. The method modeled by the master is Curtis's Martin tagline for that same structure. So,
and therefore, for the way that the Fellowship of Catholic University students evangelize,
right?
The way that they carry out their mission.
So the idea of focus evangelizing in a very particular way, they don't say it's like their own particular way. What they will say is this is how the church has done it for centuries. So they're not there to create any new model. It's simply looking at what Jesus did, how did he do it, and replicating it in the sense that what Jesus did is it's repeatable, it's transferable, it's applicable in all times and cultures and situations. And so the method is in there's three main parts to it. It's when you're walking with people, you're inviting them to deep transformation, spiritual multiplication. Oh my gosh, I just forgot the last part.
Authentic friendship.
Authentic friendship. Yeah, it seems like you read some of this stuff. So those are the main things. So deep transformation actually comes from divine intimacy with the Lord. Everybody's called to be in relationship with Jesus in an intimate kind of way, not just in like, hey, I'm going to go here and check off the box that I've attended mass or I go to confession, but I'm living a transformed life in and through Jesus as my personal friend, in a personal relationship, knowing that I was made for a covenantal relationship with God and not just simply a contractual relationship with God, which most Catholics, unfortunately, are living in that state. Mm-hmm. And, even some Christians, like we just can move God to just being some arbitrary rule that we have to please or follow, and not recognize the call to covenantal love and a covenantal relationship.
What is covenantal love? What does that mean?
So we first see this in Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis, where God enters into covenant with them. So the difference between a covenant and a contract is, in a covenant, it's an exchange of persons. So I give you my heart and you give me your heart in return. A contract is a relationship that's really based on what you can give me. I'll give you this for this. And so obviously some contracts are good. Like you go to your barber, I give you money, you give me, a really good, cool beard haircut and a hipster hairstyle.
It's coming on Friday, man.
He even comes to your house.
No. Like
it's coming on
time
Friday.
The time when that happens is coming. Oh, no.
Oh, okay. So that's pretty much what it is. And so when we understand that God is seeking and working for our good in a covenantal sense, is that he wants deep, intimate friendship with us.
Right.
And that's going to come through developing a prayer life, which is what Jesus did. Jesus constantly taught his disciples how to talk to the Father, how to be in the presence of the Father in order for them to grow in their own identity as beloved sons. So once you invite someone into that deep transformed life by leading them to accept the gospel and accepting a personal relationship with Jesus, how do you do that? You actually do that through authentic friendship. So the idea that it's actually going to happen in the context of community. It's in community that, especially I was reading 1 Corinthians last night, and there was a situation in chapter 9 where chapter 8, where they're talking about Christians still going to eat sacrificial meat offered to idols and to pagan gods, because though they've converted to Christianity, they are still leaning on some of their old pagan ways. Mm-hmm. And Paul is talking to them saying, like, well, you don't want to do anything to cause...
Knock it off, guys. Well, stop doing that.
Well, he does it gently first, and then he says, here's why. He's like, you don't want to cause your brother to stumble, and you don't want to be a cause for scandal. So what does it truly mean to be your brother's keeper, in a sense? Like, and that whole part was talking about that we are responsible for each other. As Christians, we're responsible for building each other up. And in authentic friendship and authentic communities, we have to look to the early church. How did the early church live out that friendship and that communal life? and see how, if we understand the world that the early Christians lived in, it was a pagan world, and they're trying to leave pagan behaviors behind. And how does the gospel invite them to act differently, to treat each other differently? That is what transformed them. And in the space of that community, what happens is you're inspired by other people who are pursuing the Lord as well. I just remember, I mean, the most pivotal times in my life, as I think with most people, is, those formation years as a young adult, like in college, and watching how people loved each other blew my mind. In my mind, I was like, well, that sounds exhausting. Or the way that they would inspire me by their own prayer life. Someone is struggling and they would just pray with that person, or they would invite that person to go to the chapel with them to pray. And I was astounded by that. So just watching and witnessing that actually transformed my own way of thinking. And so it's this understanding that community, God works in the spaces of community, that it's not just enough to have a private, personal, intimate relationship with Jesus. It also has to be lived out in community. So with Focus, that is through building Bible studies, through bringing people to seek, putting on retreats, whatever that is. But it's always hang out with people and waste time with them, waste holy time with them. You're not making them into a project, but it's just, we need to get back to relationship building. The third part is a conviction about spiritual multiplication. So what does that mean? It means that I have received the gospel. I'm being formed in it. So now I'm a growing disciple. But I would not be doing the Lord's will if I wasn't talking about it, if I wasn't sharing Jesus with others. And so in Matthew 28, Jesus says, before he goes back and ascends to the Father, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I will be with you until the end of the world, till the end of days. And so Jesus very clearly is saying, go. He didn't just say, hey, receive me, stay in your little bubble of community,
hooray, bubbles,
and never leave. That's not the gospel. The gospel is being sent out to proclaim that message of intimacy and that message of community within the context of church, that this is the primary place by which you experience that. And so you got to go and teach other people how to do it. And a lot of Paul's letters are ones of formation, but also ones of equipping. Like, here's how I'm going to teach you to talk to other people, to reach out to them. Here's how I'm going to encourage you in those situations. And so that is summed up as the method modeled by the master. It wasn't that Jesus had the most amazing PowerPoint presentation and it changed the world. It wasn't that,
has a PowerPoint presentation ever changed the world?
I don't know. Yeah, it depends on the person, especially if they're an intellectual. They might have just read their way into the church.
No, that's different.
That's true.
For someone to read their way in and study and come to a deeper understanding, that's fine. I've never heard of anyone saying, I saw this amazing PowerPoint presentation and it changed my life forever.
That's true. It's not. Or you know what Jesus didn't also have? And I take much encouragement from this, and this is from Father Barak. I forgot in what book, but it's always stuck out to me since I read it a couple years ago, that the early church didn't have all this amazing like sound and stage and lights and the most high-tech form of communication and all these things that we find ourselves dependent on today. It was just people. Like, the Lord chose a few people, lived with them, and then invited them to do the same thing with others. And so you don't have to be a televangelist to change the world. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it. And when you look more deeply into this idea, I guess, method model by the master, is sometimes you can think, well, I'm not fully equipped to do these things, or I'm not the most charismatic person, or I'm not the most gifted in, such and such and such. But what you see is God, one, chooses the foolish to do great big things. But two, it's the little way. It's the little ways that lead to the great things. And a lot of that is coming from Saint Therese of Lisieux, whose own little way of coming to the Lord, realizing like she herself was afraid to, well, not afraid, she just was hesitant to walk the path of identity because she thought she had to be super great like the great saints before her.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, I need to be a martyr, I need to do these things. But then she realized just in conversing with the Lord, like, actually, Lord, you want me to love you in little ways, and that's enough for you, and you're going to take me the rest of the way. And it's that same idea that actually should really be the lens by which we look at the way that we personally evangelize is, what little thing can I do today? We're in New England. Can I smile at a person who I'd rather just ignore?
No,
that's
really
weird. Like,
that's weird. We don't do that. We don't smile at people.
I find myself having to, like grocery store, for example, or like something, you just like straight faced, walk in, walk out. And I was like, Paula, what if you just smiled at somebody?
Sure.
More chances are they're going to smile at you back. Something small like that. And, it makes me feel really awkward. But I did it last week, and I'm happy that I did, because if I can acknowledge the presence of God in that person,
Mm-hmm.
even through a smile, okay, that's a small little thing that I can do. Then there's other things that I do where I will literally have a conversation with you about Jesus.
Yeah.
So that is the summary of the method modeled by the Master. It's something that anyone can actually participate in.
So the method starts with fostering friendship.
Yeah.
I meet you. I create that relationship of friendship with you.
Mm-hmm.
Entering into friendship then is an invitation to community, to be part of something bigger,
Mm-hmm.
to be part of a broader group of people. So it's not just the one-on-one. Through that community, you come to an intimacy with God that's both personal and communal.
Yes.
Because now, having met these other people, I realize that there are other people pursuing virtue, goodness, holiness. Through them, I also start to learn about Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And then that allows me to have the personal encounter with Jesus that I need.
Mm-hmm.
Having had the personal encounter with Jesus and belonging to this community, I know that I'm not alone. I know that I'm supported in that. And that will inspire me to also go out and begin friendships, initiate a friendship with this person,
Mm-hmm.
begin to walk with them and to invite them into community, into something bigger than themselves, and invite them also to have a similar encounter to what I had,
Mm-hmm.
to understand that meeting with the Lord. So it's the method modeled by the Master. Jesus does this. He calls the apostles. He invites them to follow him. And then in that time spent with them, how many times in the gospel are we reading about Jesus who is with the apostles off by themselves and talking just to them? Mm-hmm. He's instructing them. He's teaching them something. But it's also the parts of the gospel that are not recorded. Mm-hmm. That they walked from this town to this town. And along the way, what were they talking about?
I know, car ride conversations.
Yeah. It's the sense of they've grown in this fellowship and in this fraternity together as they've gone along. And then through that community, mm-hmm. Jesus is able to give them their mission, mm-hmm. to go and make disciples, to invite others to come to him. We also see it happening already in the Gospels. How many times does Philip bring someone to Jesus and introduce them? So Philip goes and he brings these people to Jesus. And through that, Jesus is able to do some great thing, either a miracle or there's a particular teaching, whatever it might be. The apostles are sent out. And we can also see that through the whole history of the church, especially in the early church, that it's this going out, making friends with people, being invited into the home, and then read the Acts of the Apostles. And again, you'll hear that one or more of the apostles went to this person's house. And after speaking with them, the whole household was baptized. Mm-hmm. The whole household was converted. They received the Holy Spirit. All these great things happen. And then a community is built up. And that community is then going to be entrusted with the mission. Mm-hmm. That's why St. Paul's letters are to these different cities, to the people of these different cities, because those places where the Christian community had built up now are being fostered and continuing to grow, but there's still more that has to happen. And so you don't see the loss of the community just because you now have the mission. Mm. Right? They've become convicted of faith in Jesus Christ. They don't lose their community for the sake of going out on mission to evangelize. Mm-hmm. Rather, they still need their community as kind of that home base, but also as the invitation, come and worship with us.
Yeah.
All right.
I would also add one more thing.
Okay.
What's interesting is recognizing that the person going out and being sent forth, that's an organic response to an encounter with Christ. Right. And it's not something that's forced. It's not something that's like, oh, I have to do this. it's something that, because you've had that life-changing encounter with Jesus, you can't help but talk about him to someone else. You can't help but share him with someone else.
A big part of the reason for my dad's coming to Christ in a deeper way was the witness of one of his friends. And this man, George Little, God rest his soul, George was an amazing, amazing human being. But he had this joy that he carried with him in everything. And if you started to talk to him and asked him, why are you always so happy? He would tell you. And it was this friendship that he was able to foster with people, and this genuine love for the people that he met that attracted, through him and through his wife too, so many people came to encounter God. Love was so real, and their affection for people and their happiness, and it just sort of overflowed. But they never had, a formal job. Nobody ever said, okay, you're going out and you're doing this mission. We're sending you officially. It was more, they said, we'd like to help with this, or very simply through friendships with people that they brought people to the Lord. Really powerfully, really, really powerfully. Just amazing, an amazing person. And so you see that value. So this is what Focus does then on campus. They go out, and in this case, the organic response is that the missionaries, the young men and women who say yes to serving with Focus, organically say yes to serving with Focus. And then they're sent out. There is the formal missioning.
There's a commissioning.
You have been sent on mission to go and do this. But it's because of that organic response to say, I want to do this. But you'll also see then that there are many who are affected by Focus, who never become Focus missionaries, but who become evangelists. Because they've learned how to be friends. They've learned how to, within friendship, share what matters to them most. And ultimately, it's that what matters to you the most. And what matters to me the most is that I love God, that I'm growing in this relationship. What matters to me most is my goal of heaven. If that's the thing that matters most, then I want to share that with the other people who I'm meeting. I want to share that with the people who I'm friends with, because what is friendship but loving another person? And willing their good. So if I love somebody, I want them to experience something of what I've experienced. I want them to share in this. I think as people grow in friendship, they also learn where they can encourage somebody to do something, and where they can't. It's not like, let's make friends with this person and then we'll get them, convert them, we'll trick them into following. No, it's an authentic, I'm sharing with you a part of my life. And as you build up a friendship, there's a certain intimacy that continues to grow. Right. All right. So I want to, from this method modeled by the master, I want to look at some other elements of the method that we don't talk about quite so much in the evangelization school.
Okay. Which one in particular?
Well, when we talk about Focus, when we talk about discipleship, this is all very good. 100%. I'm on board. But let's look then a little bit at the pedagogy of the master.
Okay.
So we have the method modeled by the master, which gets us looking at the way that Jesus called people to follow him, the way that he formed that initial community, the way that he mentored and accompanied his disciples through their early days until he sent them out on their own mission, right? And then how the apostles did that same thing. Okay, that's all very good, because this gives us a roadmap for evangelization. But when we evangelize, when we share the gospel with someone, we're introducing them to the gospel, which means that we're introducing them to the teaching of Jesus. We're not just introducing them to the way that Jesus evangelized, the way that Jesus invited people to follow him. We're introducing them to the thing that Jesus taught. So then, if we're going to introduce people to the thing that Jesus taught, the way that he taught it matters. What is the pedagogy of Jesus? How does he teach?
I like this.
I was thinking about this because it gets really cool. So the way that Jesus teaches, he teaches, first of all, in line with the way that the prophets taught. So there's a pedagogical approach that Jesus takes that is not dissimilar to what the great scholars of the law and the rabbinic teachers would have used. It is not dissimilar to the things that the prophets would have done. So if we look back at the Old Testament, we see that the prophets speak with the word of God, either by predicting something that's going to happen. So they speak to the future event that is to come. Or they speak not only to the future event that is to come, but they speak also to the reality of what God is doing by means of a sign. They perform a miracle. And this demonstrates that what they're saying is true, because this miracle could only happen by God's power. Take Elijah and the sacrifice, right? In competing with the priests of Baal, they have their sacrifice, and he says, whichever one God sends fire to consume, we'll know that's the true God. And so the priests of Baal, the prophets of Baal are hopping around the altar, slashing themselves with knives, and nothing's happening. And Elijah says, all right, here, let's go over to my altar that I've built to the God of Israel. And you know what, dump a whole lot of water on it too, and soak the wood completely so that it's completely wet and can't possibly catch fire. And then he prays, and God burns up not just all the wood and the cow that has been, or the ox that has been laid on it. He also burns up the stones themselves. Everything is incinerated completely. It's like, only God could do that. I'm right. And it's really cool, right? So you have these. Should be
a Bible translation according to Father Sam. Yeah. That would be awesome.
there are these miraculous moments that take place, and so those miracles point to something that is true. And then there's the prophetic sign. So we read about this in the Gospels, like Jeremiah takes a pot and he smashes it on the ground. And that's the prophetic sign of something that God is going to do, right? So we have the prophetic signs are part of it. Well, Jesus very much follows in those footsteps, right? He speaks the truth of what God is revealing. He speaks these things, but then he also is able to, as he's doing that, as he's demonstrating or speaking these truths, he then backs it up with his miracles. So part of the teaching of Jesus is also the miracle. Who but God alone can forgive sins? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority even to forgive sins, I say to you, my son, rise and walk. Healing the paralytic is what shows his authority to forgive sin. The healing itself is not the point. The healing itself illustrates that when he says, my son, your sins are forgiven, he in fact has the authority to forgive sins. Well, if he has the authority to forgive sins, then when he says to the apostles, whose sins you forgive are forgiven, whose sins you retain are retained, he is giving them his authority. If he doesn't have the authority to forgive sins, then when he tells the apostles you can forgive sins, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But he has demonstrated by healing that paralyzed man that he has the authority to forgive sins. And then if he possesses that authority, he can also delegate that authority. He can share that authority. So part of his pedagogy is to show by miraculous signs that what he is teaching is true. So when we read about the miracles, it's not just Jesus can work miracles. That is part of it.
Yes.
Hey, everybody wants to see a miracle worker. Everybody likes that idea. I came for the show. I'm just here for the show. Right. And then when he multiplies bread and fish, it's I came for dinner and a show. Right. Okay. That's a corny joke, but there's some truth to it though, right?
You're not wrong.
All right. So then if Jesus does this, then there's like the prophetic signs, the things that Jesus says. He weeps over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right, his weeping is a prophetic sign.
Yeah.
These different things that he does, they're prophetic signs of something that is to come, or something that speaks to that. Right. Then get into a little bit more of how he teaches. So in the rabbinic tradition, there's the parable. Even in the prophetic tradition, the prophets often use parables as a way of illustrating some truth about God. In fact, it's a scriptural tradition. If you look at the book of Job is not an historical account. The book of Job is an allegorical account.
It didn't actually happen to a guy.
Right. But it's written in such a way as to communicate some divine truth.
Yeah.
And so Jesus does the same thing. How many parables does he tell? I don't remember what the exact number is, but Jesus tells parables constantly. And he's telling those parables as a way to try to illustrate the story, as a way to try to illustrate what the gospel is really all about.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have that, the method modeled by the master covers both the way to invite people in, the way to accompany them and mentor them and help them to grow, and the way to communicate to them the truth.
I'm going to add to that, because something that I picked up through Focus is they always talked about stories. So before they ever give you a teaching, or I should probably get closer to that. Before you do a teaching or before they give a talk, notice how they always start with a story to get you to understand the point that they're about to communicate. Currently, right now, for those in training, getting ready for small groups, every chapter begins with a story, either the story of a saint or the story of someone. And that drives home the point that you're about to read. And stories are powerful. And so that is why in scripture you see stories. This is why Jesus tells stories, because something about them is captivating and it's a way that we understand.
Right. All right. So here's an interesting thing.
So
a lot of times when you're learning homiletics, you will be given the idea that a story helps to relate the homily to the people.
Yeah.
Which is true. Tell a story about your own life or about something that you've heard, and that can connect the gospel in a deeper way. There's a temptation, though, to think that you always have to have a story to go with the homily. And that when you give into that temptation, you can sometimes miss the most fundamental part. So a lot of times I find that I've gotten away from storytelling in homilies.
You don't really do stories.
I do sometimes.
Sometimes, but not
as much, and less frequently, I think, in part because what I've come to understand more is how much the Gospels themselves already speak. The story that Jesus tells speaks. And so if I'm going to start preaching, I don't need to give a story when he's just told a story. Let's talk about the story that he told, because the story that he told is better than any story I'm going to tell. I've started to learn that I can't give into that temptation. You think that my story is somehow better than his story. But if I'm giving a talk outside of the context of Mass.
Oh, makes sense.
If I'm giving a talk, that's when I'm most likely to lean on a story, because the story can actually illustrate the point that I'm trying to make in the talk.
Yeah.
But then my talk is usually not preceded by a scriptural reading where a story was told. We've just been told the story, which is in the scriptures. So I am not totally convinced that in all preaching a story is necessary. But I recognize the value of that story. I recognize the value of the story, especially when we're talking about, especially when we start talking about trying to witness to someone.
Yes.
So I want to share this with you. I want you to come to an understanding of this truth.
Which would be testimonies.
It's a testimony, right?
Yeah.
That it's my personal story. Let me tell you about what happened to me. That's why St. Paul was effective. You think that St. Paul's story of conversion only appears in the Acts of the Apostles? It doesn't. It's also in Galatians, but then there's other times. Without any question, Paul went around and he's like, let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you what happened to me. And when he went to meet the Jewish people, he would tell them about what happened to him. And that would convince the Jewish people that...
he went to King Agrippa and told him the whole story, but King Agrippa didn't convert, but Paul knew that it was at least necessary to share it.
Got to tell the story.
He's like, I got to share this. Doesn't matter what the response is going to be. I need to tell people about this.
But that testimony, it makes personal for the person hearing you the reality of the gospel. Even if they don't come to believe or they've never had an experience like this, you, as the one evangelizing, make it personal. So that personal testimony. Now, the difference with Jesus is that he's not so much telling them about what God did for him because he's God. It's more he's trying to gradually show them who he is and help them understand, but it's still deeply personal. Still deeply personal. Cardinal Schönborn has a book. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but he talks about how the face, Jesus is the human face of God. He's the icon. So when you look at iconography, especially ancient icons, and the idea of writing the icon, it's a meditation on the person of Christ or the saint or the gospel, right? So it's a prayer throughout. So the entire time they don't say you're drawing or painting an icon, you're writing an icon. And as you make the different shapes that are going to compose this icon, you're writing the eyes of Jesus. You're writing the mouth of Jesus.
And you're writing a story.
Yeah.
That's
and
really beautiful.
It's this understanding of entering deeply into the humanity of Christ.
See, now you want me to fill my whole house with icons.
Oh, I fully support that. Yeah. But the humanity of Christ reveals to us something of the divinity.
Yeah.
Right. It's by looking into the eyes of Jesus that we come to understand the face of God himself, the invisible face of God that we cannot see with our own eyes. Well, in the same way, the testimony of a Christian, the testimony that we can give of the things that God has done in our very own lives, can reveal to somebody who has not had the similar experience what God can do. And then that can be the invitation to them to take a step, give this a shot. You hear people's stories and you realize that their story is not that dissimilar from your own. The circumstances that they were in at one time in their life are things that I've experienced myself. Or you hear people and you go, okay, if all these crazy things were happening to them and I've never had to deal with any of that stuff, then what's holding me back?
Yeah. Well, that's why I love the story of Cradle Catholics, because one, more people are going to relate to it. But two, that person who was able to find a deeper love that they've always been with God, never really allowed themselves to be with God, and now is living a completely transformed life. Like, they still had their transformational moment, their encounter moment.
Right.
And giving hope to those who are sitting in that group of people, like, oh, well, I've just always been around, but this is it. I'm like, no, there's so much more, and this person totally just proved it to you. Yeah. Like, there's more. There's more, and it's beautiful. Yes. And God's doing something great. It doesn't have to be crazy. So the method modeled by the master. Just want to come back to it again. Yeah, I was going to ask to do that. Go back to your pedagogy. Pedagogy? Pedagogy. That's such a hard word for me to say. Well, so pedagogy. So you can be a pedagogue. Pedagogue. Which means that you are the one who is teaching. Oh. But you're following a pedagogy, which is the method of teaching. Pedagogy. Right? Yeah. The method modeled by the master. Typically, when in the Catholic Church in the United States of America right now, if you hear the phrase "the method modeled by the master," you are most likely listening to Curtis Martin. You are most likely talking to a focus missionary. You are most likely talking about discipleship and evangelization. Yeah. If you are looking to understand how it is that Jesus teaches, we've got to look at the scripture and read kind of the content of his teaching. But what we're going to see is that it's in keeping with everything that the prophets did before him. So he's not introducing a radical new way of teaching. That's why they still call him rabbi. Exactly. He's in keeping with the rabbinic tradition, which means that what he is teaching is in continuity with everything that has come before it. And he's doing it in a way that, if you look at pedagogical methods today, would still be important. Speak in terms that people can understand. So he speaks in terms that they can understand. His parables are agricultural because that's the world that they live in. So if we're going to try to explain the gospel, first we have to explain a little bit about the agricultural world. You know, we used to always joke that the idea of the lost sheep and the gospel of the lost sheep, that the shepherd goes and picks up the lost sheep, placing it on his shoulders and carrying it back. All the guys from the Midwest who had grown up on farms understood that in a way that the guys from the East Coast or the West Coast or who had not grown up on farms simply didn't understand, because all those guys from the Midwest had literally gone out and picked up sheep and carried them back. Wow. And the reason that you pick up the sheep and carry it back is because you can't let the sheep walk, because it'll just keep wandering away. So you pick it up and you carry it to the place that it needs to go. What? Yeah. Or they'll even break the legs of a sheep so that it can't walk away. And stays close to them. And then they bind up the legs so that the legs will heal. But while the sheep has these hobbled legs, it has to stay close to the shepherd. Wow. And so even though they cause pain to the sheep, it's for the sheep's good. Wait, that's such a prayer thing that happens. Right? God breaks you down and you're like... When basically I was a city boy compared to some of these guys, which is hysterical because I'm not a city boy at all. So the only story we have is Sodom and Gomorrah, JK. Yeah, they didn't really, like,
I learned a ton about these scriptural images from these guys who had actually grown up on farms. So if we're going to communicate, we got to communicate the gospel in ways that people can understand.
Yeah.
But that way of communicating the gospel in ways that people can understand sometimes might require a little bit of explanation about what Jesus is saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And kind of the context in which he's speaking so that we can understand that. But then, I mean, how many times in a conversation with somebody and they say, well, what about this? Like, why does the church teach it this way? You give an example.
Mm-hmm.
You make the example relevant to them,
yeah,
helping them to understand what you're talking about, helping them to understand the depth of what Jesus is asking. And then that becomes kind of a catalyst for more conversation.
Yeah, I had a student in college. She was my disciple, at least it's what we called it. And I was trying to discuss, I don't know what we were doing, but I knew she loved basketball. I hate basketball.
Mm-hmm.
I hate shooting hoops. I hate doing all these things. But for the sake of her, I would go and shoot hoops with her. And as we're doing that, I would always find a way to take what she loved, and I picked up on something. I was like, okay, well, let me take what she loves and use them as teaching moments for the gospel. And that's when it would click for her. And when I saw her this past October, she lives in the Bronx now, is teaching. She goes, Paula, I always remember how you like taught me and how you, because she's a big sports person. She goes, I always loved how you use sports to help me understand the church and the gospel. And was I equipped myself? No, not necessarily. I did my best with what I knew she would receive really well. And the Lord was able to give me, like, I don't know, maybe wisdom, insight.
Maybe wisdom.
Wisdom and insight.
It is possible that wisdom happened. We're not sure, but it's possible.
Yes, it is possible. And that's the way that that's the way that I taught her. And that was very different from my other student that I was discipling. I had to teach her in a very different way, in a way that she would receive. And what you notice about Jesus is how Jesus is still very unique in his approach to each of us. He's very different in the way it's still the same message, but he's bringing you closer to that truth and that reality according to how you work. And you kind of mentioned this in the last podcast. Not every student would do well in a classical setting.
Yeah.
And so every person their learning is different.
Right. But then there are certain pedagogical things that are sort of universal.
Mm-hmm.
Like everyone responds to a story.
Yeah.
In some way, everyone responds to a story.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Everyone responds to something that they can see demonstrated right in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
So when Jesus multiplies loaves and fish, and they see that there were 5 loaves and 2 fish and 5,000 people, they go, oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's not enough food for all of us, and yet we're all full. Something happened. When they see a man who was paralyzed
now, with
suddenly
the fish,
stand and walk.
Did they cook it? Did they eat it like a sushi? That's the detail I want to know.
Who knows?
The bread, I got the bread.
It could have been dried fish, so kind of like a fish jerky.
Like a fish jerky was replicated?
Who knows?
I want to know these things. Did everybody just happen to find enough wood to start a fire and have all these little fires throughout the group of 5,000?
It's within the realm of what is possible.
I just, we get to add to the stories as well.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I remember hearing Father Benedict Rochelle give a talk once years ago. And he said that this Jewish woman that he knew, her son came home from college and was telling her, Ma, everything's different because, Moses and the Israelites going across the Red Sea, it was just low tide. That's how they got across. It was just really shallow water. It was low tide. And he said, now the scripture scholar in me wants to correct his understanding and point out the idea that the word dry land is present there, and that low tide doesn't quite explain that the sea parted and stood like a wall on either side. So how are you getting at the idea that it was just low tide? And he said, but as I'm thinking of the historical and critical responses to it, he said, so I said to his mother, well, what did you say? And she said, you were there. Which is like, oh yeah, that's great. You were there. So how did they cook the fish? I don't know. I wasn't there. But I'm gonna trust that somehow it all happened. Anyway, all right. So the method modeled by the master.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up there because first of all, I really like the method. I think it's beautiful. Authentic friendship, which leads to community, which leads to encounter with Christ, which leads to mission.
Yeah.
I think this is very, very powerful.
It's very simple.
And then as you're trying to carry out the method modeled by the master, as you're trying to enter into it more deeply yourself, to remember that it's not just the method, but it's also the content that the method fosters, that the method allows, and that Jesus speaks in understandable ways. He speaks with signs. Most of all, he speaks with love.
Yeah.
Right? Hey, this is Roar Like the Lamb. I'm Father Sam Kachuba.
I'm Paola Peña. Sorry, that was really loud.
God bless you.